question of what God was doing before creation is a profound theological and philosophical inquiry that delves into the nature of God and the essence of existence itself. This concept challenges us to consider the very nature of time, eternity, and divinity. In many theological traditions, God is described as eternal, existing outside the constraints of time and space as humans understand them. Therefore, asking what God was doing before creation might imply a misunderstanding of God's nature. God's existence doesn't confine to the linear progression of past, present, and future. This question is significant because it transcends mere curiosity, probing the fundamental attributes of the divine nature and the foundations of the universe. It encourages believers and philosophers to contemplate the characteristics of God, such as omnipotence, omniscience, and eternal presence. In Christian theology, for example, some argue that God exists in a state of perfect love and communion within the Holy Trinity, suggesting that God's actions before creation were internal rather than external. Two illustrative examples can help bring this concept to life. First, consider the analogy of an author who plans an entire universe within their mind before writing it down. The author isn't idle, but is instead engaged in the creative process. Similarly, God may have been in a state of timeless creation, planning the universe in divine wisdom. Second, in Hindu philosophy, the concept of Lila, or divine play, suggests that the universe is a natural expression of God's joy and creativity, implying that God's creative actions transcend temporal beginnings. The question of God's pre-creational actions also invites various opinions. Some theologians, such as St. Augustine, argued that time itself commenced with creation, and thus asking about God's actions before creation is a category mistake. Others suggest that God's essence is defined by actions and relationships, regardless of temporal constraints. However, this concept is not without controversies and challenges. Skeptics might argue that pondering God's actions before creation is speculative and beyond human comprehension. There is also a debate within religious communities about the nature of divine eternity and whether God's timelessness implies passivity. Ultimately, this discourse influences other aspects of the topic by forcing a re-examination of the relationship between God and creation itself. It compels a deeper understanding of how divine action intersects with human concepts of time and existence, shaping everything from cosmological models to personal beliefs about purpose and destiny. The concept of theological perspectives on pre-creation delves into the realm of theology to explore what God might have been engaged in prior to the act of creating the universe. This inquiry does not seek to answer a scientific question, but rather to engage with theological and philosophical interpretations of divine nature and existence outside of time and space. At its core, this concept involves understanding God's nature as eternal and timeless, a being whose existence transcends creation itself. Many theologians propose that God was in a state of perfect bliss, existing in complete self-sufficiency and perfect relationship within the Holy Trinity. The significance of this point lies in its ability to deepen our understanding of the divine. It challenges and expands our conception of reality, suggesting dimensions where time and material creation do not apply, thereby inviting a broader appreciation of the divine attributes of timelessness and omnipotence. For instance, in Augustine's interpretation, God existed in an eternal present where temporal concepts like before do not hold. Two examples illustrate this concept. First, in the writings of St. Augustine, he argues that time itself is a part of God's creation, thus querying what God was doing before creation is somewhat a misunderstanding of God's eternality. he posits that God exists outside the bounds of time. Therefore, from a theological perspective, there was no before creation, as humans conceive it. Secondly, in Islamic theology, it is emphasized that God's nature encompasses pre-existence, meaning God was in a state of eternal existence. This understanding emphasizes God's independence and superiority over creation, sustaining the concept that God's will and wisdom are beyond human comprehension. Despite these views, one potential controversy arises from the juxtaposition between theological interpretations and scientific or philosophical inquiries about time and existence. Skeptics may argue that such discussions are speculative or irrelevant, as they rely heavily on faith-based beliefs rather than empirical evidence. Additionally, alternate viewpoints may come from different religious traditions or philosophical schools, which might view the concept of a deity quite differently, thereby offering diverse pre-creation narratives. Ultimately, this theological inquiry not only enriches the understanding of divine attributes, but also influences other aspects of the main topic by reinforcing the mystery and majesty of God's nature and the foundational belief in God's sovereignty and preeminence before and beyond the created order. These explorations invite believers and thinkers to ponder a reality where the divine purpose and nature are intertwined in the mystery of eternity. Philosophical considerations of time and eternity delve into the nature of time as it relates to God's existence before creation. Time, as we understand it, is typically defined as a sequential order of past, present, and future events. In contrast, eternity is often described as a timeless state, where such sequential order does not apply. In theological discourse, God is often conceived as existing in this realm of eternity, outside the confines of time even before creation. The significance of this discussion lies in its ability to address complex questions about God's nature and actions before the start of the universe. By contemplating God's eternal nature, one gains insight into a being unbound by time, which supports the notion of God's omnipotence and omnipresence. This perspective can offer comfort and clarity to those seeking to understand how God could be unaffected by the temporal constraints that govern the material universe. Consider, for example, the analogy of an author writing a novel. The author exists outside the timeline of the narrative and can thus perceive, affect, and change any part of the story at will. This illustrates how God might interact with the universe, outside time, yet capable of intervention at any point within it. Similarly, in computer programming, the programmer operates outside the virtual environment they create, unrestricted by the code's rules, analogous to how God could exist before and beyond the creation. Several philosophers and theologians, such as Augustine of Hippo, have posited that time was a construct that began with the creation itself, meaning that before creation, there was no before in any temporal sense. Augustine famously stated, "In the beginning, you created heaven and earth in your word, in your Son, in your power, in your wisdom, in your truth." This view supports the idea of a divine eternity, where time started with creation and God remains timeless. However, this raises challenges. The concept of a timeless being interacting with the temporal world is difficult for human minds to grasp. Some argue that for God to create time, he must have experienced a change in state from not creating to creating, which implies time. Others, including proponents of open theism, suggest God is somehow within time to allow for dynamic interaction with creation. Despite differing opinions, these considerations of time and eternity profoundly influence theological and philosophical discussions about God's nature and actions before creation. They encourage an understanding of God that transcends human temporal limitations thus enriching debates on the divine attributes and the nature of the universe itself. The concept of religious texts and interpretations in the context of exploring what was God doing before creation involves examining various religious scriptures and theological interpretations to understand divine actions or states prior to the universe's existence. This inquiry is rooted in the desire to comprehend the nature and intentions of a deity, a topic that has intrigued theologians, philosophers, and believers for centuries. The significance of this exploration lies in its potential to deepen our understanding of the character of God, offering insights into divine nature and intention, which can enrich an individual's faith and worldview. For example, in Christianity, the Bible does not explicitly state what God was doing before creation, but interpretations have been made through scriptures like John 1:1, which emphasizes the existence of the Word, or Logos, implying a pre-creation purpose or plan. Similarly, in Islamic theology, discussions about Allah's pre-creation state are derived from hadiths and texts that assert God's eternal existence and self-sufficiency, suggesting contemplation or planning prior to the creation of the universe. Such interpretations hold real-world significance for believers, as they can shape theological doctrines and inform personal faith narratives. For instance, understanding God's timelessness and omnipotence reassures believers of divine control and purpose beyond human comprehension. In religious education, these interpretations are applied to teach about divine attributes and the transcendental nature of God, influencing spiritual beliefs and practices. Support for this idea can be found in theological writings and philosophical arguments that emphasize the nature of a timeless deity existing outside the constraints of time and space. However, challenges arise in the form of interpretative discrepancies among different religious traditions and within sects themselves. For some, the question of before creation holds no significance, as certain theological views posit that time is a creation itself, making such inquiries nonsensical. Controversies also stem from differing philosophical stances on the nature of time, existence, and metaphysics, leading to debates on whether it is meaningful to speak of a before in relation to an eternal being. Despite these challenges, examining religious texts and interpretations concerning God's pre-creation actions or state provides valuable connections to broader theological questions about the nature of divine omnipotence, omniscience, and benevolence, influencing various aspects of religious thought and personal belief systems. This exploration invites continuous reflection and dialogue among theologians and believers alike, highlighting the dynamic interplay between faith, reason, and doctrine.